Boker Tov, Shavuot Tov to each and every one of you. This is another recording for our series, Heartfelt Haftarah. Now, we are about to embark on a remarkable journey, a miracle akin to the miracle of the oil that occurs in the story of Hanukkah. Because what you're going to see unfold over the next 4 weeks is that I will record 4 different weeks of Haftarot introductions, and my clothes will never change, and my kippah will never change. It's a early summer miracle. What I'm doing, in fact, is at the request of Bob, I'm recording the next 4 weeks of Haftarot stories all in a single day. So if I start to fade or collapse or something happens, I want you to be aware that it's just me powering through all of this. Actually, in fact, this is a very easy stretch. I have to do very little research because all of these topics are all very familiar to me, and it's not hard for me to speak extemporaneously about them. So anyway, so let's talk about this week. This week is Shavuot. It is the holiday of the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. It's an amazing holiday. It's a fantastic holiday. It's a holiday that so many of us don't really pay much attention to, but we should. It's only a one-day holiday. It does come in the summer. Those sort of things, as often happens with the Jewish calendar, we only notice that something's happening a few days in. The third day of Passover, we notice, oh my gosh, it's Passover. But Shavuot's here and it's gone, and people get confused by that. And of course, summer, where people are graduating, there are parties, people are starting to travel for vacation, it gets lost. But it's a very worthy holiday. And if you should happen to view this before Friday, know that we're going to be having a Tikkun Leil Shavuot, a series of Torah studies that will last until midnight in honor of being at the foot of Mount Sinai once again and receiving Torah. So I hope you're able to participate in our Shavuot event. But in any case, we have to talk about Haftorot. So uh, I find myself at a fork in the road, and that is that there are two things I could talk about. And one of them is the actual Haftarah, but another is the one of the central elements of the holiday of Shavuot, which is the reading of the Ten Commandments. So, I am going to have to make a decision here, and so I've decided I'm going to talk about both of them. All right. So let's start with the Haftarah. Now, one of the interesting moves the rabbis make. Oh, yeah, 10 Peggy. We're in 10 peg step. One of the interesting moves that the rabbis make regarding the Haftarot is that, as we know, all of the Haftarah come from the second section of the Hebrew Bible, the prophets. And these can be narratives, these can be oracles, these can be poetic presentations, but they're all in the section known as Nevi'im, or the prophets. Well, the rabbis make another move because they want us to recognize that there are three sections to the Tanakh, that there are three parts to the Hebrew Bible, the third part being Ketuvim. And so we don't want to neglect that. So what they do, in addition to using the Psalms in our regular worship in different forms, different ones of the 150 Psalms, for each of the holidays, the rabbis select out a book or a novella, a little book of the collection known as the writings. And so for the 5 Jewish holidays that come along in the course of the year, there are 5 different readings from the third part of the Hebrew Bible. And for the holiday of Shavuot, the novella is the Book of Ruth, a very short, lovely, charming novella. Maybe my favorite book in the entire Bible as a reader. I just enjoy it so much. It's a story about deprivation that comes to success of virtue that is rewarded, and it has a teleological element to it. In other words, what happens in this little story of little people in a little slice of an event actually has a tremendous impact uh, further into history. All right. So I'm going to describe it to you, tell you what I think are the highlights, and then we're going to talk about the Ten Commandments. So in the novella of Ruth, the story goes like this: that there is an Israelite man from Bethlehem who, during a famine, moves to the plains of Moab, where apparently there's not a famine. He brings his two sons. They all settle. They all marry Moabite women. And then, lo and behold, he dies and his two sons die. And so suddenly there are these three widows of two generations. The man's widow is Naomi. And then there is Orpah and Ruth, the two Moabite uh, women who have married into this family. Did I say that he was married to a Moabite in the first generation? That's not correct. He brought Naomi with him. That's his Israelite wife, and they have two Moabite daughter-in-laws. Sorry for that. So anyway, and so they're at a crossroads, literally and figuratively. And one of the daughter-in-laws, Orpah, decides to stay in Moab and go back to her family. Standard strategy if you're suddenly a widow. On the other hand, Ruth makes an entirely different decision, of pretty impractical decisions, that she's going to stay with Naomi, that she loves Naomi. And not only does she love Naomi, she loves Israelites, and she loves the Israelite God. And she makes the lovely speech, where you go, I will go. Your God will be my God. Where you are buried, I will be buried. This confession of love and commitment to her mother-in-law is moving in and of itself. So they go back to Bethlehem, where there's no longer a famine, but they are uh, without property. They are one of these classes of people that the property that they owned in Bethlehem is transferred to other parts of the family, and they are entirely dependent on what is called gleanings. Gleanings is one of the rules of the Hebrew Bible that says the poor among you are entitled to eat. And how it works is, whenever there is a harvest, if you don't harvest everything, you actually can't harvest everything. You should leave certain parts of your field available to the poor, the orphan, and the widow, so that they can glean and that they can survive off of that. And so that, in fact, is what happens. Naomi sends Ruth out to glean. She gleans at the field. Serendipitously, it happens to be a distant relative of Naomi's. And so when she comes back with her gleanings, which, by the way, the Boaz, the owner of the property, is particularly generous with her. He knows the story of Naomi and Ruth, and he tells his workers, leave a lot so that she can harvest as much as she needs. And so she comes back with a huge, skirt full of grain. And Naomi says what happened, and she explains. And Naomi says, "Oh, that's Boaz. Boaz is a relative, distant cousin, but he's probably a redeeming relative, meaning he has a responsibility to help out any other branch of his family that falls on hard times." So Naomi says, "Hey, Ruth, go back, continue that, and let's take this a little further. It turns out that he's a gentleman bachelor. He probably needs a wife. Uh, you could be the subject of his redeeming action by him marrying you." And Ruth does this. She goes back. They spend the night in a hut, a sukkah, where they're harvesting. And though the language is slightly coy, it's not terribly coy. Ruth takes the matter in hand and makes an intimate connection with Boaz, and he is sufficiently enthralled by this encounter with this daring young woman that he goes out to figure out if he can, in fact, be the redeeming relative. And it turns out he has to go through another individual, but that individual doesn't want to take responsibility for it. So he appears as the a redeemer, and that allows him not only to take Naomi into his house, but he actually has the obligation to marry Ruth. How convenient! And so he marries Ruth, and it all seems happily ever after. But the end part is even more important, where it tells us that, in fact, the great grandson of Ruth will be King David. So, in this remarkable Haftarah, we are told that the greatest king of Israel is, in fact, at least in part, not descended from an Israelite. He's descended from a Moabite who is not considered to be the most desirable person, according to the Hebrew Bible. So it tells us that our history is not our destiny, that any person can change their lot by changing their location and changing their decision making, and that God holds no grudges. And so it's a wonderful story. I love it so much, and I hope you take some time. It's not a big book. It's easy to read. You can follow it very quickly. I hope you take the time to read this after all. So that's uh, that's Naomi, but I'm going to keep going because I can't stop. So we just had an incident in our legislature here in Texas where it was proposed and almost passed that the Ten Commandments was going to be required to be posted in every classroom in Texas. The Ten Commandments. Now, the Ten Commandments are essential to the holiday of Shavuot. So we should be excited about this as Jews, right? It would be great if the Ten Commandments were posted in every Texas school, except there's a lot of problems with that. First of all, most of us, believe very strongly in the separation of church and state, that it's not the mission of state institutions to promote any sort of religion. We base that on the First Amendment. So that's a problem right there, but it's even more complicated. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. And that is the fact that the Ten Commandments is, in effect, a fetish. Now, a fetish is an object that people hold to be sacred, of ultimate importance, significant. It's inert. It's not a god, but we treat it as if it's divine and things like this. And I think Americans tend to treat the Ten Commandments as a fetish. We have the image of the two stones and that there are 10 commandments on them. This is the word of God, as if all the words in the Ten Commandment were one word, which they're not. And it's not like we truly understand the Ten Commandments, but we want that symbol in our classrooms. It's a fetish. It's an amulet. It's an object that we fetishize. What I want to share with you is the complexities of this tradition from a Jewish perspective. So the first thing I want to point out is the presence of the in Ten Commandments is wrong. In fact, the presence of the 10 is doubtful, and the presence of the word commandments is definitely problematic. So every single word in that phrase, the 10 commandments, falls apart when examined from a Jewish perspective. So let's start with the. The is not right. Most people identify Exodus 20 and the commandments that appear there as the Ten Commandments. But in fact, there are no less than 3 sets of 10 rules that are put out in the commandments of the Torah. And those 3 are to be found in Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 5, and Exodus 34. Now, if you look at the 2 that most people know, Exodus 20 and to a lesser extent Deuteronomy 5, they're nearly identical, but they're not identical. There are variations in both of them. So which of of the 10 commandments are we going to post? Because they don't say the same things. But they sort of say the same thing. So if you try hard, you could maybe sort of borderize them and blend them together and that sort of thing. But here's the kicker. Here's the kicker. Exodus 34, the 10 commandments that appear there are completely different than the 10 commandments that we're most familiar with. Instructions regarding observing the holidays, about sacrifices. The commandments are concerned with idols and things like that. So there's a tiny bit of overlap, but as a rule, those 10 in Exodus 34 are completely different than the 10 commandments we generally look at. And then just to add to the discomfort of this whole moment, only the 10 that appear in Exodus 34 enjoy a title, and that title is Aseret Dibrim, 10 words, 10 matters. It literally says in Exodus 34, these 10 words. Doesn't say that in the more familiar Exodus 20, doesn't say that in the more familiar Deuteronomy 5. It is this, by any measure, by the message of the Hebrew Bible itself, this is the 10 commandments. The 10 commandments appear here in Exodus 34. So we're totally confused about what constitutes the 10 commandments. But it gets even mushier and more complicated, because Aseret Dibrot doesn't mean 10 commandments. It means 10 utterances. Okay, well, where does it say 10 commandments in the Bible? It doesn't. The phrase 10 commandments, Aseret Mitzvot, never appears anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. We only have Aseret Dibrim, which applies specifically to Exodus 34. And if you think that this is some kind of trick, if you look at the frame of these 10 commandments, it is literally Moses describing how he hammers out the 10 commandments with a hammer and chisel and carries them down into things. And God says, these are the 10 Dibrim. These are the 10 words. All right. So really, if we're looking for something that we would designate the 10 commandments, it would be Exodus 34, but even the phrase commandments is misleading. In fact, the phrase 10 commandments appears only in English, and it becomes part of people's biblical tradition during the Reformation. That's only 500 years ago. And so the whole idea that there are 10 commandments is a pretty relatively new invention. When it was translated into Greek, they're called the Decalogos. Again, a very literal translation of the Hebrew, the 10 words. And so for most of Christian history, they weren't called the 10 Commandments, they were called the Decalogue, the 10 words. So what are we talking about when we say the 10 commandments have to be posted in a school? Which 10 commandments? All right. And should we even be calling them commandments? And it gets even more complicated, because if you look at the various Christian traditions, the Jewish tradition, and I'll just bring them in because it helps mess things up even more. The Samaritans, each one of them identifies the idea of a decalogue. but none of them agree on what the 10 commandments of the Decalogue are. So even though we're using the same passages with the same words from Exodus, we divide them up differently. And in fact, in the Jewish tradition, the first uh, uh, devar, the first word is, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. It's not a commandment at all. It's a declarative sentence. And then we find 9 other statements underneath it that are commandments. All right. The Catholics and Lutherans divide it up differently. They ignore the preamble, the declarative sentence, and they start breaking up the commandments into 10 below that. The Protestants of other traditions do the same, but they don't count the same phrases in the same way, and they divide it up differently again. This reflects the fact that if you seriously count out each and every specific commandment in that passage, there are 14. There are 14 discrete commands in the 10 commandments. And you solve that and you make them fit the number 10, like a Procrustean bed, by bundling certain commandments together with others until you get 10. So even the idea that it's 10 is not misleading, but it's a kind of highly symbolic number in which the verses are forced into the 10 model. All right. And the Samaritans make it even more complicated because part of their 10 is actually the postscript that follows after the last commandment, which changes the number. It's all divided into 10, but again, it's different from either what the Jews or the Catholics or the Lutherans or the Protestants are doing. So when the legislature says they're going to make it the 10 commandments, uh, we have to dissect that. And it turns out that what they're pursuing is a fetish, an object that they think represents something that it really doesn't. And, we could go to court and we could walk through that, which would probably actually be argued on First Amendment issues grounds rather than the fact that no one knows what they're talking about when they say the 10 commandments. But you could make the argument that no one knows what they're talking about when they say the 10 commandments. It's not 10, and it's not actually commandments. So I hope you've learned something. It's not that these ideas, these commandments, these phrases, these passages are insignificant or unimportant. They are important. And Jews have recognized them as important since biblical times. But that somehow this represents the essence of all, or this is the embodiment of morality, which is the argument that's being made on behalf of by the state. Uh, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't survive examination. So, but however, this legislation failed. So we don't have to deal with that. Instead, I can just explain to you how fascinating it is that the sacred number 10 gets repeated so many times in the Hebrew Bible in such interesting ways. So that's it for Shavuot. I've got a little bit of a Shavuot lesson in there for you. And I look forward to you watching me looking just like this for the next 3 weeks. Take care, everyone.